Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm here for a second time with Dr. Iris Berent. She's professor of psychology at Northeastern University in the US. Her research examines the nature of linguistic competence, its origins, and its interaction with reading ability. She is the author of The Phonological Mind and, more recently, The Blind Storyteller, How We Reason About Human Nature, and that's the book we're going to focus on today. So, Dr. Berent, thank you again for taking the time to come on the show. It's always a pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you so much for the kind invitation. I'm delighted to join you.
Okay, great. So let's talk a little bit first about the main thesis of your book. So what would you say you tried to show there in terms of how people think and reason about our psychology, about our human nature and things like that?
Certainly. So we, by which I mean lay people, we really would like to think that we have a pretty good understanding of who we really are, who is our nature, where our thoughts and feelings come from. And it turns out that we are actually wrong in significant ways. So, for example, if we ask people, what do you think infants know? Do you think they have a notion of number? Do they know that 1 + 1 is 2? Do they know that helping others is good? Do they know anything about language? Do they know that blah is a better syllable potentially than uba? When we ask these questions to lay people, they tell you, no way, there's no way infants know this. And research actually suggests that they do. Now, interestingly, for emotions, we make the opposite mistake. So here, people say that they are certain that emotions, facial emotions, are innate and that you can recognize them immediately on the face and the body. And research here suggests that actually you don't. So people are really systematically wrong about who we are. They think that our cold cognitions must be learned. They appear not to. For our more warm emotions, people here are convinced that they are imprinted on their bodies and they are inborn. And that too is controversial. So the question that I'm asking in this book is, why are we wrong about who we are? Why we essentially are blind to our human nature? And the culprit, I suggest, may very well lie in human nature itself, in the very core principles that make our mind tick. And I suggest that this has quite broad consequences. It really can mess up with our scholarship. It can interfere with science, with our understanding of the brain. It can mess up with social matters, such as, it can promote biases towards psychiatric disorder. It can implant beliefs in the afterlife. And all those false stories, our view of ourselves, are wrong, probably because we, the storyteller, is born blind.
Okay, so I guess that we could say that this also has something to do with the so-called nature-nurture debate, right? And in this case, you refer in your book to the empiricist-nativist debate. That's how you frame it. So yeah. What is this debate really about? And do you think that people are also wrong in how they think about things in that manner, or not?
Yeah, absolutely. So the debate goes back thousands of years back, right? So we know that the debate concerns the origin of knowledge. So the question is, you think about abstract concepts such as an object. Where does a notion like that come from? And empiricists, the British empiricists, for example, tell you that knowledge is obtained from experience. The rationalist alternative, going back to Plato, indeed, suggests that knowledge is innate. Now, this research in infant cognition actually suggests that Plato's views were actually pretty much on the right track. So the psychologist Elizabeth Spelke has suggested that infants are born with some notions of core knowledge that actually have some parallels with animals. She suggests that chronology includes, for example, our early understanding of objects, some notions about the social world, a rudimentary capacity to understand number. Other thinkers, for example, Chomsky, talk about universal grammar as innate set of principles of language. Steven Pinker refers to it as the language instinct. These are slightly different proposals. So Spelke's claim is that our core knowledge includes principles that have continuity in animal cognition. So animals show many of these cognitions, of these principles. In the case of language, this seems to be largely a unique human capacities, but in both cases, these capacities are inborn. They include principles, abstract ideas that are inborn in humans. And those ideas really determine our early understanding of the world. So these are the prisms through which we understand and construct our understanding. And that understanding, in fact, can be quite distinct from the one that is given to us by our senses, for instance.
Mm-hmm. Right. And let me just ask you one question about this so-called core knowledge. When people refer to it, they are not really referring to something that is explicit or conscious, right? I mean, this knowledge is basically subconscious and implicit. It has to do with some sort of algorithmic calculations that occur there, and that babies, information from the environment that babies process in predetermined ways, let's say.
Exactly. So yeah, absolutely. This is tacit knowledge. These are not explicit principles. And indeed, we see many of them in newborn infants and in non-linguistic animals. So clearly, these are not verbal principles. Perhaps a couple of examples will help clarify these notions if you think this is helpful. So, for example, one example is the notion of an object, right? So Spelke suggests that infants think about an object as a bound whole rather than as a set of parts. So to think about a concrete example, if you had an infant, a newborn infant, that would only see their mother through the rail of the crib, so they only see, her say head, and they see her leg, but they never see her torso. So they don't know that these two parts are in fact connected. And the question is, what does the infant conclude? Do they conclude that their mother consists of two parts, or do they consist, or that she is a whole object, a whole body, so to speak? And researchers examined this question looking at newborns, and to examine that, they would present newborns with an object, say, this is my object, but it's occluded behind something else and it's moving behind it. And the question is, does the infant think that the object is this, or just the two parts? To find out, researchers compared the two possibilities, and it turns out that newborns are in fact surprised to see the two parts, suggesting that they expect the full objects. Similar research was done in chicks, for example, with the same conclusion. So it suggests that our notion of the object is given by the principle of cohesion, distinct from what the senses are giving us, because in this example, the infant had no sensory evidence that in fact the torso exists.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What lay people think about this is that they tend to associate ideas or knowledge with something that we get from our environments, right? That is information that we get from other people. And so it is more of an empiricist approach that lay people usually have to this, correct?
Yes, indeed. So we have, perhaps I should tell you, put it in the context of my own research. So I got interested in this question of what people think, how people think about the origins of knowledge, partly due to my own frustration explaining the notion of universal grammar to lay people. And it's one thing to say, I don't believe that universal grammar exists. You don't have the right evidence to show it, which is totally a logical claim to make. But my sense was that people people's worry with the notion is not so much with the evidence, but rather with the question itself. And that prompts me to go and, I said, okay, I'm a cognitive scientist. I have the tools. Let's find out what people actually think. Let's present them with either abstract ideas, including notions of sentence structure or the notion of what is an object. In fact, let's present them with the experiments that have been done on infants and ask them to predict what do you think infants and people would know in the absence of experience. And what we found is a rather nuanced answer. So it is not the case that people think that no aspects of the psyche are innate. People are perfectly happy to accept that emotions are innate. In fact, they are positively biased to think that emotions are innate, even when we give them evidence to the contrary. But when it comes to ideas, to abstract concepts such as, and ideas that in fact have been documented across cultures, suggesting that they are good candidates of being innate, so notions such as having a concept of a person, forming sentences, keeping track of time, here people say that these are not innate, even when we present them evidence to the contrary. They say the same. In fact, when we describe to them the experiments that were done in infants and ask them to predict, what do you think infants would do? Will they show a notion of an object? And they say, no way. When we present them with, do you think that infants will prefer happy faces to angry faces? They're sure, yeah, they have no problem with that. But it's specifically the notion of ideas that they have troubles with. Even when we ask them about birds or aliens, so even if we contrasted an abstract structure of the bird song, we told them birds always have this particular structure. They begin with one note A, they end with another note B. There is anything in the middle. That's actually true for the swamp sparrow song. And we compare that with specific motor behaviors, such as the manner in which they move their head. And then we told them, scientists actually think that both behaviors are inborn. So tell me, if we're going to take an egg and raise it in isolation, do you think that the bird will manifest these behaviors? And they were reliably more likely to accept the motor behavior as inborn compared to the abstract knowledge concerning sound structure. They said the same even when we told them about aliens, right? So it looks like they are really systematically and selectively resistant to the notion of innate ideas.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And another interesting question here is, we've already talked about core knowledge, about people's intuitions or ideas about where our knowledge stems from, our ideas basically. But is it the case that people are also predisposed because of their core knowledge to think this way? I mean, to think that ideas tend to be obtained in an empirical way and emotions are innate and things like that?
Right. So indeed, the novel claim in this book is the assertion that these biases might very well arise from core knowledge itself. Perhaps before we go there, maybe we consider other explanations for why people might be biased in this manner. So the possibility that people are empiricist has not gone unnoticed. Several people have thought that something like that might be going on, although until recently this has not actually been investigated in a systematic way. And one possibility is, people might be innocently ignorant. They may not they don't know better. They also have a lot of experiences with learning themselves. So they know that they learn math in school, so they think that the notion of number therefore must be learned. I think certainly there is something to it. I do not say that this is wrong. I just think it's insufficient to explain what's going on, because you certainly learn motor skills too. You learn swimming, you learn how to swim. So that's not doesn't exclusively apply to ideas. Also, people resist innateness even for animals and aliens on which they know very little, or at least certainly less than what they know about humans. And furthermore, people resist the notion of innate ideas even when you give them explicit evidence that the trait in question is innate. So all those lead me to think that it's not just that they don't know better, but they actually are actively biased in this way. Steven Pinker in The Blank Slates actually entertained the possibility that our trouble with nativism is not just passive, but rather an active aversion to nativism. But as I read him, I think that for him, the main motivation is really the concerns with the social consequences of nativism. So if you and I are born different, then perhaps there is room for discrimination and worse, right? So it's really the social concerns that drive that. And while I think he's totally right, and people are in fact concerned in this manner, the question then arises why you should care about ideas. So if why should worrying about the notion of an object lead to any social implications? So I think he is totally right, but it does not explain what needs to be explained here, namely why the resistance is specifically to ideas. Mm-hmm. So my proposal is that the aversion really is selective to ideas. People are not generally averse to all form of nativism, and it's not a social stance, but rather it really arises from our nature, and I think it arises from two intuitive principles of core cognition, or rather two fundamental principles of cognition that are grounded in core cognition, and those are intuitive dualism and intuitive essentialism.
Mm-hmm. So could you explain perhaps those concepts? Because sure. I guess that most people are not familiar with them. So,
of course. So Paul Bloom, in a wonderful book, Descartes' Baby, suggests that we are all essentially Descartes' babies in the sense that we are intuitive dualists. We think about the mind as immaterial and distinct from the material body. Yeah. And this theory is supported by experimental evidence that demonstrate dissociations between situations in which people are invited to think about what happens when you replicate the body and what happens when you replicate the mind. So if I were to replicate you, Ricardo, and there's going to be a second Ricardo, what of your original traits will transfer to that second creature? And what people say is, yes, he's going to have the same hair and he's going to have the same beard and so forth and the same eyes, but he may not know where you live and he may not remember when you were born, and all those psychological traits will not transfer. On the other hand, if we're going to switch minds and you're going to get my mind somehow, then you will get all my psychological properties. You will remember where I was born and what I know, and you'll write the Blind Storyteller, but you're not going to look like me. So this dissociation suggests that mental and people think about properties of the mind as body and body as distinct. And it doesn't look like this is just a Western thing. So there is evidence from small-scale mind-opaque societies in which it's not polite to talk about the minds of others, that shows that people still distinguish minds and body. Really beautiful experiment by Chudek and colleagues that show these properties. And indeed, when you think about that, I'm not saying that it's unlikely, in fact, that dualism itself is innate. I mean, there's no reason why natural selection should care about dualism. However, dualism may very well be grounded in core knowledge, in as much that core knowledge systems distinguish between the properties that we assign to objects and those that we assign to agents. So as we mentioned, when newborn infants think about objects, they think that they follow the laws of physics. For example, they move by contact. So, if this is a ball, they expect the ball to move only by contact. They don't expect the same of agents. So if you see a man and a woman, and the woman was going to start walking by herself, infants are not the least surprised by that. So in fact, they suspend the principles of physical causation, and instead they think that agents move by following their mental states, by their goals, by their intentions. And those have been demonstrated in young infants. So it's this association, it's this distinction between these two systems of core knowledge, one that concerns objects and another that concerns agents, that could give rise to dualism. Now, dualism can be a problem for the notion of innate ideas because it happens to conflict with the second principle of core knowledge, which is intuitive essentialism. So maybe I can tell you a little bit about what essentialism is and how the conflict arises.
Yeah, sure.
So intuitive essentialism is the knowledge that guides our understanding of living things and their innate properties. So we think that a dog is what it is because it is born with some innate, immutable essence. And there is a large literature that shows that. Mm-hmm. When you read this literature very carefully, there is further evidence that people think about the essence as material, as a piece of matter. So for example, when young children are asked, shown a little dog and they're asked, why is the dog brown like its mother? The answer that they give is, the dog inherited, they don't say inherited, but the dog has this little piece of matter that they got from the mother, which suggests that the essence is embodied in some piece of matter. And this is also evident again, not just in Western kids, but also in small scale societies everywhere. Now, if you combine dualism and essentialism together, so people have long known that there is evidence for intuitive dualism and there is evidence for intuitive essentialism. What has not been noticed before is that those two principles are actually in conflict. So if per dualism, knowledge is in the mind, which is immaterial, whereas per essentialism, my innate essence must be material, then it follows that knowledge, which is immaterial, cannot be innate because it cannot satisfy essentialism. And that presents a novel explanation of why in our intuitive mind ideas cannot be innate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so let's apply also those two principles, let's say dualism and essentialism, to try to understand how people think not about ideas now, but about emotions, because there's also an ongoing debate in affective science about, I mean, people discuss if emotions are innate or if they are in some way learned or acquired during people's lifetime. So, and I guess that you get people like, for example, Jaak Panksepp studied emotions in mice, for example, and he was one of the pioneers of the field of affective neuroscience, for example. And there are people like Franz de Waal that straight out tell you that that it makes no sense for us to think that emotions are not present in other animals like our cousin primates and others. So, I mean, there are two questions here, I guess. The first one is if one of the sides is right and the other is wrong, if it's more complicated than that, and then also our intuitive thinking about emotions, right?
Yeah. So as an external reader of this literature, I don't feel it's my role to solve any of those debates. My contribution perhaps would be to tell people, listen, some of the debates and the way you're framing the questions actually mirror how lay people actually, the type of misconception that you see in lay people, and you can draw the conclusions yourself about what that might imply. So just as we mentioned earlier, people think that infants have innate emotions, that they will innately recognize emotions in the face, that emotions are imprinted in the face and in the body. And essentialism provides the explanation for that, because if you think that the essence is material, emotions satisfy this requirement, because in lay people's view, at least, emotions manifest in the body. So you can there is some correlates, perhaps not precise, but there is some correlate of my happiness in my face that you can recognize. And that gives you the sense that emotions actually are embodied. And since per essentialism, what's innate is embodied, then by satisfying this requirement, you obtain evidence that emotion perhaps is indeed innate. And in fact, when we ask people, so I didn't mention before, but the proposal that I gave about innate ideas, in fact, we did go to the lab and tested each of the legs of the syllogism that I just described for ideas. We did the same also for emotions. So, for example, we asked people to predict, will hunter-gatherers recognize emotions universally? So if they saw your faces, they've never seen a Westerner before, would they be able to tell what you're feeling? People said yes, of course. And in fact, the more they thought about the emotion as embodied, the more they thought the emotion is likely to be innate. People said that the emotion is going to be innate and recognized by the hunter-gatherer, even if we told them, listen, this emotion is actually learned. Scientists are certain that there's no way these emotions we told them that scientists are convinced that these emotions are acquired. People still claim that for basic emotions like anger, disgust, fear, and so forth, that these emotions are in fact innate. So it's kind of interesting when you look at the affective science literature, when you read it, that how the question is framed, right? So the original question is, our emotions are innate. But when you read the literature, a lot of that is about, do facial manifestations of emotions, are these innate? Or, can you tell emotions in the voice? Or can you recognize a specific brain area that for anger and so forth? The answer on that is it's a huge literature and it's hugely debated. So going from the early work of Paul Ekman that suggested that yes, you can recognize emotions universally, to more recent work by my colleague Lisa Feldman-Barrett that claims that no, this emotion recognition is not reliable. You can't find any brain area that reliably corresponds to anger, say, and so forth. And in fact, she claims that even in Westerner, you can't even read my emotions. So in my mind, the question is not so much who is right, although it's very complicated, but rather the question is, why do you frame the question in this manner? Who cares about whether or not emotions are imprinted universally in the face? And of course you care, but why this is the decisive question? And it seems here, and I think that here the proposal that comes from evolutionary psychologists like John Tooby and Leda Kosmidis that claim that emotions are in fact computations make a lot of sense. So my sense of shame, if something shameful happens to me, how much shame I feel really depends on my calculation of who saw this event, how, did you see it, or my husband saw it, what was the event exactly, and so forth. So all those suggest that what might be innate may very well be the computation, not necessarily the embodied manifestation of the emotion. And in fact, there is no reason to think that in some cases it might be even silly to expect that to be innate, because why should I manifest innately my shame? Maybe it's better for me to actually hide that. So I think the possibility at least exists that some of the ways in which the question has been formulated in the field of affective science might be in fact due to the fingerprints of essentialism, and perhaps this is something that we should take into account when we read this literature.
Mm-hmm. So just to clarify this point, because I think this is important, when you talk about emotions in your book, because you mentioned there two aspects of it, the computational aspect and how people manifest their emotions on their body, on their face, and so on. But the other aspect, where sometimes when people talk about emotions, the debate gets a little bit complicated because there's also the subjective experience, but that's not included when we talk about emotions. That's feelings, right?
The distinction I think that we should draw is the one between emotions as computations and emotions as embodied manifestations, as manifesting the output of those computations in the body. The computations may very well be innate. It's the manifestations that may or may not be innate, but I think it might not be prudent to confound the manifestation of the computation with its underlying mechanism, the computation itself.
Okay, so let's talk now about other examples about how people apply these intuitive knowledge that we have in our intuitive psychology to other aspects and also to some scientific debates. Like, for example, let's talk about embodied cognition, because that's more and more prominent in cognitive psychology and artificial intelligence and other areas. So why are people so drawn to this suggestion that perhaps many aspects of our cognition are or have an embodied basis, let's say?
So perhaps we should talk about what embodied cognition means.
Sure.
So the question there is, how are concepts represented? So what is my concept of this battle, right? And one tradition says that this concept is represented by abstract symbol. What the symbol is, we don't know, but the proposal is that whatever the symbol is, it is distinct in principle from, it's arbitrary and it's distinct, say, from my sensory experiences and my motor experiences. The embodied cognition rejects this notion. So on the embodied view, my notion of a battle is actually the sum of my sensory and motor interactions with the battle. It's the coldness of the battle, it's the roughness of the battle, it's the weight of the battle, and it's all those sensory and motor capacity and experiences that constitute my notion of a battle. And in fact, when I come to think about this the battle, I need to simulate those experiences, because that's what it means to think of a battle. So I have to simulate how my hand is going to hold it and so forth. Now, the notion of embodied cognition is actually supported by a large body of evidence. So we do know indeed that people have detailed notion of sensory and motor interactions. So for example, people's estimate of how steep a hill is going to be depends on whether or not they're wearing a backpack. We know that abstract verbs activate specific motor areas. So we know that primary motor cortex has distinct representation, say, for the leg and for the arm. But when you hear, when you read the notion of kick, it's the leg motor area in the brain that is active. When you read pick, it's the arm or the hand motor area that is active. And furthermore, you can stimulate those areas in TMS and show systematic effects on understanding. So one reason why people are drawn to embodied cognition is because it says something right, because there is, in fact, all these sensory and motor interactions are at least associated with our abstract concepts. But this is not the debate. I think that many researchers would accept the literature at face value and show and say that, yes, all this information is stored with my concept. The debate is different. The debate is whether this is my concept. So whether my concept is, in fact, entirely consisting of those sensory and motor interaction. And the strong embodiment view says that that is in fact the case. And that, I think, this exclusive view, I don't think is right. I think there are reasons to think that it's wrong. Why people go there, here's where you might think that dualism and primarily dualism, perhaps a little bit essentialism too, have something to say about that. So if you're a dualist, you have a problem. You have a problem because every behavior, every time I do this, this presents a huge mystery to you, because for the dualist, it's my idea, my abstract mental state of a battle that presumably commands my very material arm to reach to the battle. And that is total nonsense, because how is it possible for immaterial mental state to exert causality over a material entity? So that creates a huge dissonance, and that's a problem. And if you're a cognitive scientist, that might create a problem to you as well. In reality, you shouldn't be disturbed by that, because the computational theory of mind is not a dualist theory at all. But if you don't think about it carefully, you might be led to the dissonance. And embodied cognition solved the dissonance, because it's telling you, listen, cognition doesn't really exist. There are no abstract mental states. It's all sensory and motor interactions. And per the research that I've described, people have no troubles recognizing sensory and motor interactions, identifying them with the material body. So now, if you go to the embodied view, it's the material body that commands the material body, right? It's my sensory and motor notion of a cup that commands my hand. Matter commands matter. The dissonance is solved. Everything is good. So I don't think this is something that lay people necessarily will fall for, but if you think about the science, that certainly might seem like a viable solution to you.
Mm-hmm. Right. And what about neuroscience? Because it seems that nowadays many news come out after some papers get released, and people really love to look at the different brain areas with different colors activated and things like that. Why do people like neuroscience, and particularly fMRI with those colors and so on, showing different brain areas activated, performing different tasks? Why is that so alluring to people?
Yeah, and this too so it's the same dissonance that I just described that actually can explain the same phenomenon. And just in case, to make it clear to people who are joining us, it's a totally irrational reaction. So, you see people read newspapers, right, and saying, mm-hmm. It was discovered that musician brains are different than non-musician brains, and what's the news here? Why should there be any difference? So, you hear that they're different because they play differently, and the difference cannot lie in any other place rather than the brain, right? So mm-hmm. It's rather curious. And in fact, we know from research that it's not just that people are surprised, but they also find brain explanations more satisfying than behavioral explanations, even when, in fact, the explanations make no sense and they're circular. And it's, again, the same dissonance that is the destiny of the dualist that can drive this, because, once again, if you're a dualist, you don't understand how this is possible. You don't understand how cognition can happen. And by saying that it's your brain that's doing that. So if you're embodied cognition, you're saying cognition doesn't exist. If you're a neuroscientist, you're saying it's the material brain that is actually affecting and causing those behaviors. And that, again, solves your mystery and solves the dissonance. Essentialism might also have something to whisper here in your ear, because when people say it's in the brain, remember that essentialism suggests evidence, it's a way of thinking about innateness. And when you identify psychological traits in the material brain, people interpret that as suggesting that this property is in fact innate in human, because it provides evidence that is consistent with essentialism. Sure. So people might interpret information such as musician brains are different as evidence that maybe they were born this way. If it's in their brain, therefore perhaps they were born this way, and that perhaps adds to the significance that they attribute to the news.
Yeah. And so what about psychiatric disorders? Because that's another muddy topic, let's say. I mean, even defining mental disorders is not that easy because there are cultural elements as well, and sometimes it's difficult to distinguish between them because there are many overlapping symptoms, for example. So, here we are talking about how people think about those kinds of things. So, how do people think and reason about psychiatric disorders?
Entirely, exactly. You're exactly right. So, yes, this is indeed about our perceptions rather than about the etiology of the disorders themselves. And here is where the history here is quite painful because at least in the US, so we know that psychiatric disorders are associated with stigma, with distancing. People even attribute some danger to a person who is suffering from those conditions. And in an attempt to combat those conditions, at least in the US, the Surgeon General decided to tell people, listen, these are actually brain disorders. It's a disease like all others, right? It's exactly like Parkinson's, it's exactly like cancer, it's in the body. And the hope was that once people understand that this is a medical physical condition, that the stigma will go away. And it did not. And in some ways, it actually got worse. So what the research now shows is that people who, and even in fact clinicians, think that disorders that are in the brain actually elicit all kinds of negative attitudes. And the question is why people react in this manner. I think that, again, it's the same mechanism that we identified before that explain that. So if people per essentialism assume that the essence is inborn, then if people are told that the disorder is now in the brain, they interpret that the disorder is in fact hereditary, that you're born with that, it's your destiny, therefore the disorder is immutable. It's less likely to change even if you get therapy. It's only less likely to change by talk therapy because you're also dualist, right? The talk therapy does not affect the material body. And it's this distinction that promotes pessimism and also promotes stigma because then, if you're born with a different essence to mine, then it suggests some a very profound difference between us. And we've done some research that suggests indeed that when you inform people about psychiatric disorder and tell them the disease is manifest in the brain, people indeed do jump to the conclusion that the disease is inborn, and their stigma increases. So that unfortunately suggests that core knowledge may in fact drive this misconception.
Mm-hmm. Just before I move on to the next topic, let me just ask you, so people, when they see mental disorders associated with the brain in some way, they think then that they are innate, to some extent at least. Do they also think that they are immutable, that is, that we can't really do anything to change those people?
So in these experiments we presented people with a patient and we told them this patient is diagnosed by a test, and the test is either a brain test by which we are only asking, we're telling people if the person has the disorder, then you expect the brain to show a spike in activation, or if there is the disorder, then in a behavioral test, you're going to respond faster or slower, and we're giving people all the detail. The idea here is that all the brain test is giving you is whether or not the person has a disorder. It provides no additional information about, perhaps if you knew what the area in the brain is, you can infer some more about the mechanism. Nothing. All you know in both cases is exactly the same, except for in one condition, you can link it to the body, and in the other condition, you can't if you're a dualist, because all you know is in behavior. And what we find is that when the test is diagnosed, or when the disorder is diagnosed by a brain test, people are significantly more likely to say that the disorder is innate. They tend to think about it as more immutable, and they also tend to show more negative attitudes toward that disorder.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, and since you You are basically a linguist or do a lot of work in linguistics. Let's talk just a little bit about one particular disorder, dyslexia. So, how do things work there, and also how do people tend to think and reason about dyslexia, that kind of condition, and and how do they think about people that suffer from it?
Yeah. So there is what the science tells us, and there is what people think, and they are not aligned.
Yeah.
What the science tells us is that dyslexia is a hereditary brain disorder that impairs reading ability. Dyslexia is a heterogeneous condition. Dyslexia can arise from all kinds of reasons. In fact, the definition of dyslexia, there are many definitions in fact, but the definitions that people are used to diagnose dyslexia are ones that are done by exclusion rather than by inclusion. So they do not specify a specific cause, but rather they're saying you can't read even though you're intelligent, you have opportunity to learn to read and so forth. So it stands to reason that people will have dyslexia for all kinds of reasons. So it's not just a single disorder. However, the most frequent symptom that one sees in dyslexia has to do with the mapping of letters to sounds. So there is a lot of research that shows that when skilled readers read, they are doing what in the US we call phonics. You are, that when you see the word dog, you know that D is a D and O is an O and so forth. You put them together and that's how you get the phonological form of dog. And that is an integral part of your reading. People with dyslexia have huge difficulties with that. So when you give them a novel word that they have never seen before, they will have troubles decoding it. They also have problems with spoken language processing, which perhaps is less familiar to people. So they have problems with awareness of the phonological structure of the word. What is blog without the first sound? You're supposed to say log. People with dyslexia will have troubles. They have problems even in speech perception, very subtle problems. So they don't have hearing problem, but they have problems in identifying speech. And in fact, some of those problems you can see in infants who who are at risk for dyslexia because their families have dyslexia running in the family. While there are all kinds of reasons to dyslexia, the most common problem is in mapping, have to do with phonology in some way and with speech perception. This is not what people think. When you ask lay people what happens in dyslexia, first, there is still denial of dyslexia, even in public figures. So there are still, even among decision makers, people who publicly say that dyslexia doesn't exist, which is quite concerning. Even teachers who are in training to, to teach kids how to read think that dyslexia primarily is a visual problem, that it primarily concerns letter reversal. In some of the research, people say that it's not even a reading disorder. And the question is, why do people have those misconceptions? Of course, there can be many reasons. People know that reading requires learning, so it makes sense that if they think about dyslexia as a serious condition, they don't think that it arises from that. But then that doesn't quite explain why they think that dyslexia doesn't affect the brain, right? It's one thing to say that dyslexia is, if it's a severe disorder, it's going to be visual, but why should it be not a brain disorder? And it's here again that it's possible that core knowledge might give rise to some of the confusion. If you think about disorder as a serious condition that is innate, then mechanisms that have to do with cognition do not seem to be like a good explanation for such a hereditary disorder. On the other hand, if you know that the problem is really in the cognitive aspect, then you have troubles understanding that it's actually a brain disorder that is innate. So together, these two core principles might explain both why people have these particular misconceptions and also why they're opposite to the misconceptions that you have about psychiatric disorder. So this is not in people's view, many psychiatric disorders are associated with emotions, which may or may not be correct. It stands to reason, therefore, that people will jump to the conclusion that those conditions are innate and immutable. For dyslexia, people think about it as more of a cognitive problem that is associated with knowledge. It therefore stands to reason that people either say this cannot possibly be a brain innate disorder, or if they do, they think about it, it's really a sensory disorder. So again, I think that it's an interesting mirroring of the dichotomy that we see between thoughts and feelings that we discussed earlier.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so let's just talk about one last topic before we finish the interview that is somewhat different from the others, but it's very interesting. The topic of how dualism and essentialism applies to a particular idea, the idea of the afterlife that is present in probably all cultures, and that's already interesting because that points toward it being a human universal, right? And that's something that we're also going to touch on here. But then, and it's also associated many times with religion and things like that. So what are some of the principles or ideas stemming from core knowledge that give rise to these general cultural idea, or probably even not that cultural, because it might be also innate, or people might be predisposed to think about the afterlife, about these kind of ideas?
Yeah, so it does look like ideas about afterlife are quite general across cultures. It only doesn't look like, in fact, the psychologist Jesse Bering has shown that even people who do not believe in explicitly in afterlife actually show that they have troubles rejecting the notion that afterlife exists when you put them under time pressure. He documented beliefs in afterlife in 4-year-old children in Florida and across cultures. As I mentioned, Chudik and colleagues demonstrated beliefs in transference of the mind to other creatures, even in societies in which you don't speak about the mind per se. So it doesn't look like this is something that is due to institutionalized religion at all. However, the question is why this arises. And Jesse Bering's original explanation is basically the reason why you think that the dead keeps thinking is because you cannot envision the notion of not thinking. You can envision the notion of not seeing. You can close your eyes. You can perhaps not hear, but you can't envision what it means not to think, and therefore you are drawn to the conclusion that it's thinking that's going to transfer to the afterlife, and not the sensory and motor capacities and the physical capacities. Dualism obviously presents a very viable explanation of that, and in fact, now that we see that that dualism and afterlife present the mirror image of each other, so in fact, it's the very same principles that explain why you think that ideas cannot be present in the beginning of life, why ideas cannot be innate, that explain why ideas cannot persist in afterlife. It's the same ideas that explain why ideas are present in the afterlife. And the reason for that is because ideas are immaterial. In fact, we've run some of these experiments, and we showed that in the same materials in which we have demonstrated that people think about those ideas as are not likely to be innate, for those same ideas, people also say that they will persist in the afterlife, and the tendency to do so correlated significantly with the perceived materiality of these properties. So we asked another group of participants to rate those traits for materiality. The more material a psychological trait is, the less likely it is to transfer to the afterlife. So our explanation is that it's really dualism, not the lack of imagination that makes you believe in the afterlife. Essentialism, however, may have something to say there as well, because when you look at the cross-cultural beliefs, if it were only dualism, you would think about the afterlife as entirely devoid of any material manifestation, and that's not the case. So in Mexico, on the Day of the Dead, people think that you need to bring food to the dead, right? And often when cultures think about reincarnation, the dead requires certain, or the soul requires certain medium to manifest itself, a certain bird. Man's soul can move to another man's soul, not to a woman. When Emma Cohen and colleagues asked people to think about the transference of the spirit, people said that there must be a specific object to which the spirit will attach, a stone or a plant. This doesn't make sense from the point of view of dualism. If the soul is immaterial and if the mind is immaterial, why should it care about this material manifestation? It also doesn't explain why my father-in-law, for instance, my daughter always buy her clothes on consignment, and my father-in-law says no, that it's the dead contaminates those clothes, and it doesn't make sense at all. Essentialism explains all those beliefs, because our notion of the self it's a dual notion of the self. On the one hand, we have it coming from dualism as the immaterial being that's distinct from the body. But then we also have a biological notion of the self that is embodied. And I think it's these two beliefs, the conflicting manifestation of thinking about the afterlife are explained by those conflicting principles.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay, so Dr. Berent, let's end the interview here. Just before I mention the book again, would you like to tell people what are some of the best places on the internet if they want to find your work?
Amazon. So the book itself, you can find it on Amazon. You can find it on Oxford. It's published by Oxford. You can check out my website from some recent publications. And thank you for the opportunity to talk about this with you, and for the excellent questions as always, and for doing this channel, which is I listen to often, and I'm very much impressed by it.
Okay, thank you so much for the kind words. And guys, again, the book is The Blind Storyteller, How We Reason About Human Nature. If you are in quarantine, then go to Amazon, to the link I will be leaving in the description box of the interview. If by the time I release the interview, this coronavirus crisis is over, then run and buy it. It's a very interesting book. I read it, and I found it amazing and very well researched. So Dr. Berent, again, thank you a lot for taking the time to come on the show, and it was a real pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you so much, Ricardo.
Hello everybody, thank you for watching this interview until the end. I've been putting out regular interviews with top academics and intellectuals from around the world and a variety of fields. And now, to keep the channel sustainable, I would really like to ask you to please pay a visit to my Patreon page and to consider making a pledge there. Any amount, even just $1, would already be a great help. And we also have links in the description box to PayPal and other places if you want to make donations there. Otherwise, and if you like what I'm doing, please share it, leave a like, and hit the subscription button. Finally, I would like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and supporters: Karen Litzke, Anne Blanchett, Pererga Larsen, Lau Guerrero, Francis Ford, Hans Frederick Sunda, Janne Henninen, Ricardo Vladimiro, Craig Healy, Adam Kessel, Olaf Alex, Jonathan Wiesel, David Diaz, Anian Kata, Jacob Klinkby, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollesy, Enrique Lenius, John Connors, Paulina Barron, Philip Force Connolly, Dr. Jerry Mueller, Herbert Gintis, Rutger Voss, Bo Weingard, Rebecca Newberger Goldstein, and Dan Demetriou, Robert Windiger, Rui Inácio, Arthur Coe, Zoop, Marco Neves, Max Bailby, Colin Holbrook, Susan Pinker, Thomas Trumbull, Bernardo Seixas, Pablo Santurbano, Simon Columbus, Jorge Espinha, Phil Kavanagh, Corey Clark, Mark Blythe, Roberto Inguanzo, Mikkel Stormir, Eric Neumann, my producers Isar Webb, Rosie, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Elewelyn Osborne, Dr. Ian Gilligan, Sergio Quadriano, Luis Caetano, and Matthew Lavender. And finally, my executive producer, Michel Rugieski. Thank you for all.